You would not believe the amazing conversation I just had with Dr. Margaret Rutherford, a psychologist for over 30 years, a TEDx speaker with over 1 million views, and the author of Perfectly Hidden Depression. I asked Dr. Rutherford, what does that even mean? Perfectly hidden depression. We had a great conversation where she described what the characteristics or traits might be for a person who struggles with perfectionism and could potentially be depressed. We dug deep into what underlies and underpins people feeling this way, and more importantly, what are the next steps. To get more information on this amazing conversation, I invite you to tune in to this week's episode. Dr. Margaret, as a notable psychologist for over 30 years,
Yeah, it's a long time.
a, yeah, a TEDx speaker and author of The Perfectly Hidden Depression, I would love for your wisdom, insight, expertise on what does that mean? That's such a unique term, perfectly hidden depression. Can you just
Yeah.
explain what that means in your words? And then how did it come about for you to write a
Yeah.
book about it?
I actually still get goosebumps telling this story. I'd be more than happy to because it was a decade ago, Kim. And I had just sat down to write my regular blog post for my website. And I was thinking about some people that when they walked in my door, they would have vehemently denied that they were depressed. And I didn't really see them as depressed either. They were pretty happy and they didn't really know why they were there. They might be having some anxiety or some kind of sleep problems, maybe an eating problem. But they would look at you sheepishly and say, my friend told me you were really good and that's why I'm here, but I don't really know why I'm here. In fact, I feel silly. I'd ask the questions about the symptoms of different things. No, that's not me. But what I learned over time was that after several of these people came to see me, is that what the common thread for all of these folks the common thread was that they couldn't talk about painful emotions. They didn't know how. They could say, oh, yeah, that made me really sad. But could they actually express sadness? And actually would look at me and go, I don't know what you're talking about when you say, what, tell me how you feel right now. I feel fine. It's just so covered up. And so I literally pulled this term out of the air because I did learn that these people had trauma that they had kept secret for a long time. They had definite patterns of some very poor self-esteem hidden by an extremely successful life. And I called it perfectly hidden depression. And I named the post The Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person Are You One? The damn thing went viral. I'd never had a post go viral. I didn't even know enough about it to know what was going on, frankly. And then I didn't. I had to, what is going, is something wrong with my laptop? So that's how naive I was. But I was also writing for the HuffPost at the time. The post appeared on the HuffPost, and I had forgotten that I had left my email on the bottom of the post. I got hundreds of emails. It's here in my head. How do you know this is going on? I've never heard anybody talk about this. And I just got curious. I said, surely people are writing about this. And so I started looking. Of course, I found Brene Brown. She had just written The Gifts of Imperfection. And she's very prolific and she's wonderful and has written a bunch of other stuff since then. And I read The Gifts of Imperfection. I found a book called I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terrence Real that had been written in 1998. Wonderful book, still very popular. But he was talking about men's depression and that male depression tended to be more covert than women's. And I didn't really agree with it. I saw what he was talking about, but I didn't think that's what I was talking about. But then I turned to the academic literature, and it was all over the dangers of perfectionism, the dangers of especially what's called socially prescribed perfectionism, where your life is really about meeting expectation after expectation, and it's like a treadmill. It never stops, and you're only as good as your last achievement. Well, when I figured that out, I thought, I always tell my clients, if you think it should exist and it doesn't, then create it. Here I was, this completely unknown Fayetteville, Arkansas therapist, never written a darn thing but an email. And I thought, okay, I'm being called to do this.
Mm.
Lo and behold, I started writing about it, trying to actually figure out what it was, while also asking people to email me if they identified with what I was talking about. And I identified these 10 traits of what I called a syndrome of perfectly hidden depression. It's not a diagnosis. We can talk more about a syndrome. Anyway, these people started from all over the world started saying, I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you. A brain surgeon from Virginia, an ad exec from California, a motivational speaker from Mississippi, graduate students galore. It was incredible. And so I did over 60 interviews with people who had volunteered, and I learned so much, and I learned from them. And that's how perfectly hidden depression got started, because I started writing about it.
First of all, it's an incredible terminology. I had never heard of it before, and yet I am a recovering perfectionist. I've been doing masks off for people pleasers and perfectionists for over 4 years. And when I
Good for
saw
you.
that, thank you. When I saw that, I'm like, wow, that is really interesting. Perfectly hidden depression. And then I started to listen to some of your podcasts and I started really thinking about it. And one of the things you just said that just stood out to me. You said many things, but I'm going to highlight one of the
So,
things you just said.
yeah, you should be taking notes.
Yeah. Because I'm a perfectionist. I should be taking was that the people that came into your office couldn't, you said, express their feelings or emotions. Maybe they could, in passing, say, yeah, I'm sad or yeah, this, but they really couldn't go deep into that. So I'm in the process of writing my first book right now, and it's a
Good for
memoir.
you.
Thank
Mhm.
you. And one of the chapters that I'm working on, or that I say often throughout the book, which is my story, and I think it's a common thread for many people who have this perfectionism,
Mm.
is that and I'm 55 now, but when I was a kid, I was not allowed or taught or modeled to, one, identify my feelings, let alone feel them and express them.
Exactly.
So I grew up in a dysfunctional alcoholic home, and you weren't allowed. You weren't
No.
allowed. So I learned at the ripe age of 6, 7, 8 years old that if I had big feelings, I needed to squash them.
Right.
And then the way that I learned, and this is the way perfectionists learn to survive and cope in the world, is to put
Right.
on that mask of
I
perfectionism.
call it camouflage.
Camouflage,
It's
for sure, because it
camouflage for
camouflaged who I was and what I felt. And the only way that I felt I could be safe if I was perfecting, performing, and
Mhm,
pleasing. But
mhm.
that was a lot of anxiety to have to be at that level, just like you mentioned that a perfectionist will be, all right, did this thing. Now what's the next? What's the next? What's the next?
Right.
And the achievements just keep going and those expectations are so high. But because it's such an, I feel, epidemic in our society, people
Mm.
see that as just being normal. It's almost a badge of
And something
honor.
exactly, and something very desirable. And
Yeah,
so, just like everything else, we seek people who live life that make the choices we live, makes us feel more comfortable. These folks are usually attracted to each other to hang out with and to make sure that you're on the same incredibly difficult journey that they are, but then everybody says, "Oh, no, I'm fine. There's no stress to this." And the really scary thing, tragic thing is that what I also began hearing about, and this is backed up by all, is that this is tied with suicide rates.
I know.
That these people, what is generally known about suicide is that it is the only way out that these people can see. Their pain is so great. And then you add perfectionism onto that, and they haven't told anybody about this pain. And they don't not even sure what it is themselves sometimes. So I'm counseling right now 2 people whose spouses kill themselves, and everybody was just absolutely shocked because this is the person who's always there. They're the person at church that knows everybody's name. They're the person in the community who's the first person to volunteer. They're your soccer coach. They're your pastor. They're your sometimes, sadly, your best friend that you didn't even know this about her or him or them. It's a uh, People have asked me, "Was this you?" I learned perfectionism from my mother. I
Mm,
learned anorexia from my mother,
mm.
but this was my mother. She also had some other issues. She had full-blown OCD, but she just could not risk ever looking out of place, and some of that was the time. But, at the same time, I watched and learned and then adopted some of that myself until I figured out that wasn't really gonna make me happy.
Exactly. And that's the piece of your book and your work is the hidden, right? Because it's hidden.
Right.
We hide it. Again, thus the mask.
Which
And
we all do. We should point out to
yes,
your listeners,
yes,
that's a skill. If
yes,
my dog had died this morning, which is an analogy I often use, and I had this interview, I'm obviously not gonna show up sobbing about my dog. The
right.
ability to put some or if I'd won the lottery
Well,
and then
that one I
somebody
hope you would come on and be like all excited for me.
but still, you do, you have compartmentalization, it's a skill.
Yes,
But these folks do it so rigidly and so actually automatically sometimes it's become an unconscious process that
yes.
they don't know who they are anymore. I just say, "Oh, I don't ever cry. I'm just not a crier." That kind of
So let's talk about because I think that's really important. And then maybe we can let the listeners know if they identify or resonate with any of what we're saying, some maybe
Sure.
small actionable steps or reach out to you. But let's talk about so the suicide is one thing that you mentioned. And then another that I would add in is that I feel so many people will n- numb with substances, right? Like
Yes.
they will just deny that pain is there. So in order to avoid that pain and they push it down, there's numbing, alcohol, marijuana,
Mhm.
spending, gambling, whatever, as a way of coping. Do you look at those as being
It's
signs and
actually
symptoms?
it I have to be careful with the word symptom because that is what you have when you have a a disorder.
Yeah.
This is not a disorder. This is, again, a syndrome, a behavior, a collection of behavior and beliefs that you often find together, like codependence. It is one of the traits. It is that you could possibly have another problem, mental illness problem, mental disorder that has to do with maintaining a sense of control, an outward sense of control.
Mm.
That is one of them. But things like some of these things are surprising to people. Like one of the traits is toxic positivity,
Mm.
that you are always telling people you look for what you're grateful for. And that's true, but not in if that is your only option. I tell people all the time life is an and. If you have 4 children, you've always wanted a large family, that's a blessing, and that's a lot of lunches and a lot of soccer games and a lot of tests and a lot of homework. I mean, it's an and, it's both, it's and. Something is good and it is hard.
Yeah.
Um, one of the others is you deny the impact of emotions. You don't even really your range of emotion is generally limited. Shame is a huge part of it.
Oh,
These critical inner voices of shame and things that you're carrying around that are much more about the family, as you said, raising a family or actual abuse or neglect or whatever, or just only being rewarded for being a high accomplisher that or being enmeshed with a parent where you believe your value is in pleasing that parent and then
yeah.
you just carry on with that lifestyle. And so some of the ones have been a little surprising to people, being very highly responsible. needing a lot of control and then worrying, but not letting anybody know you're worrying. It's the traits are and very little and true intimacy in these people's
Yeah.
lives. So, basically, you're right, obviously, about the substance abuse, sorry.
Yeah.
The substance abuse and that kinda thing by covering up. Yes, that is something I talk a lot about.
So I chuckled there for a minute because you were so describing me, one person, the way I
Oh.
was recovering.
Uh-oh.
But here's the thing. So we did a really good job of outlining and discussing the problem, some of the symptoms, and what it looks like. In terms of moving forward and switching the lens here for a moment, one of the things that I believe firmly in is going to the underneath, the root cause, like going into the pain, going into the trauma and healing that. So that's part of my framework. My 5-step power pathway is really being able to heal, like, and heal my inner child and all of that. Because when, and I believe that when we heal the pain and we can grow up our adult selves and have our adult self show up for our child self, the one that was initially wounded, then when we do that, when the adult self shows up and creates inner safety, then there is less of a need to wear the mask. There's less of a need to show up in the world other than who we truly are. So, this is how we can be our true selves and come into wholeness. And it's been my experience and it's my belief that when we come into wholeness, then we can experience true inner peace, true joy, abundance, and fulfillment, more fulfillment in our relationships because we're showing up as our true authentic selves rather than with the perfection mask, rather than with the people pleasing mask or whatever mask, codependency, whatever pattern. Because for me, masks are patterns. Whatever pattern that we are used to playing out and showing up with in our relationships no longer needs to be on the front burner. We can now show up. I can show up as my true self. If I hadn't done the work to heal, I wouldn't be able to have this interview with you right now because I
Mhm.
would go into, oh my God, Dr. Margaret Rutherford, she's a psychologist. She's been a psychologist for 30 years. Who am I to have a conversation with her? I don't have my shit together. The whole perfection imposter syndrome stuff would come up.
Yeah,
But
of course.
because I have worked on that pattern and I've healed it, I now know that you're a human being. I'm a human being. My essence is going to connect with your essence. And we can just have a conversation, like I said in the beginning, just two friends just chatting and bringing some value to the world. I wouldn't have been able to do that 5 years ago.
Mhm.
So this is part of the work. And I'm wondering, and I'll say one other thing and then let you share is your quote. This is a perfect way to bring in the quote, right?
Sure.
Which is, you said, your quote is, my definition of self acceptance is recognizing that neither your strength nor your vulnerabilities completely define you, and vice
Right.
versa. So I feel that quote ties in beautifully with what I was just sharing. So, any thoughts on that?
Yes, a lot. I think you're using a language and you're using terminology, inner child, my adult self, my child self. It's got a lot like internal family systems that some people understand and welcome. And I think that is it. That's why I think internal family systems works very well because you're actually saying there are parts of me, there are voices that, again, not hallucinatory voices, but
Yes.
there are parts of me that are still affected. Like I'm a child, and then there's my more rational, reasonable adult, and my emotionally modulated adult, hopefully. And then there are other parts of you that kind of speak to that. Kim, if I have learned one thing in 30 years, I don't care really what you call it. If what you call it works for you, good. I don't fuss much about which treatment modality that people use as therapists. I think most of the time the meta-analyses of therapists show that if you are as a therapist are comfortable with a certain modality or way of doing therapy, and you are engaging your client in that same modality and that they get it too and that they understand it and it works, then that's the relationship you want. Some of these things are basic that you're talking about healing your inner child, and I talk about self-compassion.
Mm.
That's okay. So what's the
Yeah.
difference?
And that's what I had to end up learning how to do for myself is to have self-compassion and grace. And for me, it's the biggest and best antidote to perfectionism because a perfectionist is so hard on oneself that having self-compassion is so hard. It's been so hard for me to
Well,
cultivate that practice.
yes, and the other thing that I tell people all the time is that it's a working with someone, if any therapists are listening, and you have someone who you believe is depressed, but they're also very perfectionistic, you can't use the same strategy that you use with people who show up with a major depression or moderate depression. You simply can't use that strategy because it is too threatening
Mm.
to someone. They have to have a lot of control. You don't give assignments, in my estimation, because it's like that game of Jenga where you have to pull out exactly the
Yes.
right piece so the whole thing doesn't crumble down, and you will get that information from your client when they say, "I'm ready to look at this." And you can give them options of what they wanna look at, but, "No, I can't do that work yet." And if you push it, you'll push them away. And so it's a very collaborative approach. It's not therapist guided, it's client guided. And then also, this is for non-therapists and therapists alike. If somebody says, "Okay, I think I have this perfectly hidden depression," and or identify with it, and they go to the doctor and say, "So I'm depressed," and they'll pull out their DSM-5 or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology and Psychiatry. You don't have these symptoms. You have lots of energy. You don't look depressed. Your friends aren't telling you something's wrong. You eat regularly, you sleep great, you're very active, you exercise and blah blah blah. Now you're not depressed. No, they're not classically depressed, but you will miss, the therapist will miss, or the person will feel invalidated. I've had so many, in fact, in the comments on the TEDx, several people are saying, my friend just thought I was being dramatic when I said, no, I really don't talk about who I am very much. "Oh, you're the most open person I know." It's like they fooled everybody.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of disbelief or even just plain old no, you're not depressed, and so it makes it very hard for these folks to it's like my experience, I had panic attacks. In fact, I had performance anxiety. I was having a panic attack during the TEDx,
And
and people will look at me and go, "You seem so comfortable. What in the world? You don't have panic?" And I'm like, "Mm, yeah, I do. Just watch me one of these days."
that's such an important point because that just completely dismisses and discounts your experience.
Right.
And then you almost double down on hiding it even more.
Because
So,
you risked, you told somebody,
yeah,
and they just went, "Ugh, y you you don't have anything to be depressed about. You have the life everybody else wants."
I think the most important thing that we can make, there's so many important things in this episode, but one of the most important things is if that happens to someone who is
Yes.
listening and can identify with all the things we talked about,
Mhm.
and they have that type of experience, what can you say or suggest for that listener in terms of a next step? Besides the fact that we are validating for them that what they're feeling, if they feel that they've been dismissed or discounted, that we're validating that for them, number one. But number two, like, what would they then do next?
Mhm. That's a great question. I think educating themselves about it, either listening to my podcast, I've had people take my podcast in to their therapist and say, I want you to listen to this because I have not tried to fool you into thinking I'm this person, but I haven't told you some because I don't know how. I don't know how to talk to you about something like that. I really like you. I like working with you, but I need you to understand this about me. My book is one of them. Brene Brown's work is certainly, I Don't Want to Talk About It is a great book. What I don't like, and you brought this up at the very beginning, what I don't like about a lot of the perfectionism guides or the workbooks around perfectionism is they leave out the part that you I believe, clearly stated was important is that's the root cause. I can wear one earring or make a mediocre meal and decide I'm okay. I'm not perfectionistic anymore, except that shame is going to, as soon as I do that, then don't do that again. That was fine one time, but it will kick back in. And and recognize, wait a minute, something either happened to me or people who are culturally a minority have this all the time. They grow up being told, you've got to save this family. You've got to be we need somebody that is going to have money, or we need somebody, we're not respected. You need to go out and create that in the world. And that's not a bad message. It's just that what if they falter?
Mm.
Or what if and a lot of Black women who I've worked with have said to me, Margaret, if I wasn't perfect, I didn't get chosen. So perfectionism was for me a mandatory thing. Um, and it's hard to take apart. It's just hard to take apart. And I'm glad you've done it. That's fantastic.
Yes, I know. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So we are talking about so many different things. And what I'm really feeling from this conversation is what a monumental problem it is in our society. Even
Mm.
Jenny Wallace's book on, I think it's called The Toxic Overachievement Culture, where she talks about for teenagers just how the toxic grind culture is just really wreaking havoc on our teens and young adults. And it's just even with all of our adults. So it's a huge monumental problem. And I think it's not one we can tackle in this one conversation, this 30-minute conversation. But what we have done is we're raising awareness. We've outlined some really key descriptors of what it might look like or feel like for someone who might be a perfectionist and is struggling with depression. I have one other quick question that just came up. Is it possible for a perfectionist to not have depression?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was just wanting,
There's a distinction between what's called destructive perfectionism, which is what you and I have been talking about, and
yeah.
constructive perfectionism, which means that you can accept making mistakes, that
Mm.
you are enjoying the journey as well as where you're going. You don't if you end up not getting there, well, I learned a lot on that. I'm trying to do that. It is much more of a relaxed,
Mm.
you are just innately someone who thinks, I don't particularly want to be involved in it if I'm not going to do it to the best of my ability. Sure. And you've probably been reared in by people who were emotionally more stable and were there for you. And when you made mistakes, they didn't shame you for them and they didn't need you to do anything particular for them. So yes, in fact, when I first started writing about this, I remember some vitriol that I got over Facebook that said, you are pathologizing stoicism and resilience. And you want us to be a bunch of namby-pamby whiners. And I went, no, 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 I don't. And because you can be a constructive perfectionist, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is more shame-filled, just unable to accept mistakes and very guarded, and as you say, toxically achievement-oriented.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things maybe that we can just round out with is what came to my mind when you were talking about it is one of Brene Brown's quotes where she always talks about the distinction between striving for excellence versus
Mhm.
perfectionism. So when you were
Mhm.
saying like constructive perfection, that's what I was thinking, like someone who is striving for excellence and yet can still accept mistakes or imperfections. Whereas
Right, right.
a pathological perfectionist, or even if that's a word, has a very hard time. accepting
Yes,
any imperfections because there's an underlying belief of not enoughness. So,
right.
yeah, I
To
love
go
that.
back to
This
my
Go
to
ahead.
go back to my
Your
quote, it's
quote.
like
Yeah,
self-acceptance is recognizing that your strengths are there and they're to be honored. I frequently say, I have 3 letters after my name, Ph.D. I'm thrilled. I worked hard for those damn letters.
Mhm.
I've also been married 3 times. I had a very chaotic decade where I married 2 people that I never should have, and it was horrible, and, that I carried that shame around for so long, but neither one of those facts about me define me completely. They're both true. I've now been married almost 34 years, by the way. Um,
Congrats.
but thank you. I can live with both those things because I know that it's an and. I am a PhD psychologist and I've been married 3 times. Or as my husband calls himself, he's my current husband after 40 years.
I love that. Oh my gosh. Always have to have humor. Always
Oh,
have to
sure.
have humor. So, this has been just an amazing conversation. And just to underline again, we're not going to be able to solve anything today, but we did a great job of bringing awareness to this concept of perfectly hidden depression. And I really appreciate all of your wisdom and your insights. And thank you so much for being a guest today. But before we leave, where can people find your TEDx talk? What you
Sure.
as a therapist, if they want to reach out to you to work with you, where can they find you?
I will be 70 years old this year. So,
No
yeah.
way. Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's phenomenal.
So I have cut back a great deal on my practice.
Good for
So
you.
I'm taking a few people now and then as new people, but so I'm not really, this has never been for me about getting clients. But my website's drmargaretrutherford.com. My TEDx has almost 1,100,000 views at this point.
Congrats.
So you just put in TEDx Dr. Margaret Rutherford and it'll be right there. And my book is called Perfectly Hidden Depression. I am currently writing a workbook for that book, although there were 60 exercises in the book itself. I want to do a simpler version of that. I think it will be easier. Thinking of that Jenga game again. That's going to be published by New Harbinger here in a bit. So there we go.
Congratulations, and I'll have all of that in the show notes, of course.
Thank you. Oh, and I have the self work podcast too. So
Yes, oh, and your podcast, yes, of course.
yeah,
Yes, which is the sign in the back. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you, Kim. It's been an absolute delight.
There you have it, the amazing conversation with Dr. Margaret Rutherford. I was blown away, and I hope that you were as well by her wisdom and her expertise, and just this really profound conversation on perfectly hidden depression. I had myself never heard of the term before and learned so much just by listening to Dr. Rutherford. If you found this episode to be helpful and you identified with some of the characteristics or traits that Dr. Rutherford outlined, I encourage you and I invite you to either reach out to Dr. Rutherford or find another therapist who can help you, especially if you're feeling extremely depressed. I encourage you to reach out and take the next steps. I know it can be really hard and it can be scary, especially if you have perfectionistic tendencies, and it you are worth it and you matter. So I invite you to try to reach out. If you have questions for me or comments for me, you can respond here, or you can go to my website, kimgrosscoaching.com, where I have my email. I have all of the places where you can connect with me. And you can also take my quiz to find out if you are a perfectionist or a people pleaser, which is always helpful and informational. And if you're following me on YouTube, I would love for you to subscribe. You can leave a review on Apple or Spotify, and that will just really help the content to get pushed up and out so that I can help bring value to more people and share the insight and the wisdom from my many fabulous guests, particularly Dr. Margaret Rutherford.